20. Amazing facts about World War I. British troops were prepared for battle. It is commonly believed that ill-trained troops were sacrificed in the trench war against the Germans on the Western Front. But archaeological evidence in England in the form of elaborate training trenches, instructional models, and full-size mock-ups of the German lines increasingly reveals the military's attempts to provide soldiers with realistic training. Despite these preparations, the murderous firepower of artillery and machine guns meant that millions died on the battlefields. People feared the German invasion. Most people think pillboxes were constructed in the Second World War, but they were originally built to counter fears of invasion in vulnerable areas during the First World War. 700,000 women entered the workforce. During the war, women increasingly entered previously male-dominated industries. By the war's end, around 700,000 were employed in metals and chemical works, the majority producing munitions. One very visible effect of this change was the growing acceptability of trousers as an item of women's clothing. The warring nations used millions of horses. Horses served traditionally in the cavalry, but were also required in vast numbers by the transport services. Britain sent agents all over the globe to buy tens of thousands of horses and mules, especially from the United States and Australia. The animals arrived in converted ships and were housed in vast stable complexes known as remount depots, often near railway lines, before being shipped to the front. Tanks were first used at the Battle of the Somme. In 1915, David Lloyd George, the Minister of Munitions, declared, "This is an engineer's war." And, in the same year, Foster's of Lincoln, a firm of agricultural equipment manufacturers and engineers, was awarded the contract to manufacture a new weapon, the tank, for which there were great hopes. On September 15, 1916, just 49 were deployed on the Somme, the weapon's first use on the battlefield, but in November 1917, over 400 went forward at the Battle of Cambrai, the first significant use of tanks in battle. Over 3,000 tanks were manufactured in Britain during the First World War. Britain manufactured and used poison gas. The Germans first used poison gas on the Western Front in the Second Battle of Ypres in April 1915. Britain responded by manufacturing several war gases at several locations across England, and in Banbury, a local engineering firm perfected a machine for filling mustard gas shells. The earthwork remains of National Filling Factory in Banbury are protected as a scheduled monument, as is the circular gas testing trench at Idmiston Down, Wiltshire. Roll-on, roll-off ferries were developed. The port of Richborough in Kent was a 2,200-acre, state-of-the-art port built by Royal Engineers from scratch in just 2 years. From 1916, it handled nearly all the hardware of war shipped to France and salvaged in the form of spent shells and damaged vehicles brought back to Britain from France. It employed 20,000 men housed in 3 large army camps. At Richborough, roll-on, roll-off ferries were developed to speed up loading and unloading. Very little remains today. However, one of its innovative loading ramps was relocated post-war to Harwich and later protected with a Grade 2 listing. Many Indians, Africans, African Caribbeans, and Chinese served alongside the British. Many people from all over the British Empire volunteered to serve Britain in the First World War, not only on the front line but also in the Labour Corps on construction projects, such as the Chinese wall sea defences at Orford Ness, Suffolk, and the Western Front handling supplies and building camps. Buildings in London were damaged during the war. During the First World War, Britain was the first country to suffer an attack from a sustained strategic aerial bombing, offensive bombing. By German airships alone killed 557 people, and in London, many historic buildings were damaged, including this medieval window in Lincoln's Inn, London. In the city, plaques and scarred buildings still bear witness to these attacks. Major advances were made in prosthetics. Many servicemen lost limbs or were severely disfigured during the war. This led to great advances in developing and producing prosthetic limbs and pioneering plastic surgery. Start of World War I. 100 years might seem like a very long time ago, but it isn't really. Your great-great-grandparents were around then, and they would have lived through and maybe even taken part in this terrible conflict. Lots of history books have been written on World War I facts and why it started, but it all boils down to the fact that Europe had split into two large families of countries. The Allies, the British Empire, France, Belgium, Russia, and later the USA, were in one family, and the Central Powers of Germany, Austria, Hungary, Bulgaria, and Turkey were in the other. On August 4, 1914, Germany invaded Belgium, and so, standing by its promise to stick up for Belgium, Britain declared war on Germany. Length of World War I. When the First World War began that summer, most people thought it would be over by Christmas. Many believed that Britain was so powerful it could win very quickly. In fact, the First World War lasted 4 terrible years, not 4 months. Life in trenches. Soldiers in the trenches would spend their days doing chores, firing at the enemy, playing cards and writing letters home. Incredibly, 9 out of 10 men survived. By the winter of 1915, the opposing sides had both dug long ditches called trenches which faced each other, in some places just 30 minutes apart. These lines of narrow trenches stretched from the Belgian coast to Switzerland and were known as the Western Front. Over 5 million British soldiers spent time living in these muddy, miserable ditches, taking it in turns to be on the front line, the trench closest to the enemy. New type of war. This war was very different from conflicts of the past. For the first time, powerful new weapons and vehicles were used at sea, on land and in the air, resulting in many people being killed or wounded. In Britain, you could sometimes hear what sounded like thunder coming across the English Channel from Europe. In fact, it was the huge boom of big guns, called artillery, being fired on the Western Front. 75% of all men who died in World War I were killed by artillery. Animals in war. Both on the battlefield and back at home, some incredible creatures helped to transport soldiers and goods and save lives. Almost 1 million horses were involved in the war. Soldiers on horseback were known as the cavalry, and horses also pulled some of the gigantic guns, ambulances, and supply wagons. Gas from horse droppings could even be used to power lamps. British families gave their pet dogs to the army so they could carry messages in special tubes on their collars, see above. Dogs were fast, difficult to shoot at, and they also caught rats. Pet pigeons were drafted in to carry messages over long distances. Often carrying news from the front line back to Britain, Germans trained hawks to kill any carrier pigeons they saw. Goldfish did their bit too. After gas attacks, the gas masks were washed and rinsed. And if the rinsing water killed a goldfish that was placed in it, that meant the masks still had poison on them. Children during World War I. Did you know that Boy Scouts and Girl Guides had a vital role on the home front? Girl Guides would make basic medical equipment for wounded soldiers, like bandages, swabs, and slings. They also worked growing vegetables and delivering milk. Boy Scouts collected eggs for injured troops, protected roads and railway lines, and delivered messages. Armistice Day. On the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month in 1918, World War I officially ended when an agreement known as an armistice was signed by Germany and the Allies. This date is known as Armistice Day and is still commemorated each year when people wear paper poppies to remember those who fought and died in conflicts around the world. The pretty red flowers were the only things that grew on the bloody battlefields of Western Europe. War of pollution. National resources were mobilized as each combatant nation raced to supply its armed forces with enough men and equipment. In Britain, early failures in munitions manufacturing led to full government intervention in war production. These controls helped its industry produce nearly 4 million rifles, 250,000 machine guns, 52,000 aeroplanes, 2,800 tanks, 25,000 artillery pieces, and over 170 million rounds of artillery shells by 1918. War of innovation. Advances in weaponry and military technology provoked tactical changes as each side tried to gain an advantage over the other. The introduction of aircraft into war left soldiers and civilians vulnerable to attacks from above for the first time. Major innovations were also made in manufacturing, chemistry, and communications. Medical advances made the First World War the first major conflict in which British deaths in battle outnumbered deaths caused by disease. Destruction. The First World War left an estimated 16 million soldiers and civilians dead, and countless others physically and psychologically wounded. The war also forever altered the world's social and political landscape. It accelerated changes in attitudes towards gender and class, and led to the collapse of the Russian, Austro-Hungarian, and Ottoman empires. The cost of waging total war, and of rebuilding afterwards, ravaged the national economies of both the victorious European allies and the defeated Central Powers. The human cost of the First World War for Britain saw the creation of a new language of remembrance, which remains to this day. It can be seen in war memorials in cities, towns, schools, places of worship and workplaces, as well as in rituals such as Remembrance Sunday and the 2-minute silence at 11 a.m. each 11 November. Communication in war. What can you find out about your family's involvement in World War I? Ask your grandparents whether their parents, aunties or uncles ever talked about life during this time. Do you have any postcards or photographs from the war? Perhaps there are campaign medals belonging to a relative at home. Write in and tell us about it. We'd love to hear your family's stories. Subscribe if you love this content. Always remember that history is fun when you're around. Until then.